work? Are you just going to join in when you want to, or
Sure.
am I supposed to challenge you to join in? What?
Yes, no, both.
Okay. Okay. Welcome everyone. It is this is the Bible class that we're recording for Wednesday night, April 1st. As you know, if you watched last week, I started a two-part study. I was talking about the topic of love from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and specifically trying to make application to our marriages and how we treat each other in our marriages. But obviously it goes further than that. We're talking about how we treat each other, and including how we would treat everybody. And I think that 1 Corinthians 13 is a great chapter for that. It is talking about the length of time that the miraculous gifts would be needed, but the application is very much the same, because what Paul was doing is he was using what we would understand in order to help us understand something that we were having, that they were having trouble understanding at the time. And last week we talked about having patience with those that we love, having kindness toward those that we love, as well as having a level of humility and extending forgiveness to those that we love. Now, I did last week's by myself. This week, Rich agreed to join in. He obviously will have some things to add as we go along. We don't know how this is supposed to fit together. We haven't practiced it or studied it together or anything like that. We're just going to to go along as we can and try to complete out what the thoughts were that we had on 1 Corinthians chapter 13. But we're dealing with, how do you say, I love you? You want to add anything in the introduction, or we just want to get started?
Well, I think you make a lot of good points throughout the lesson that you provided me with the notes about saying I love you is not a single thing. Like, there's a lot of different steps that go into it, and we can learn a lot both from 1 Corinthians 13 and from the history of the Bible with the way that God acts towards us.
Yeah, okay. And by the way, we're kind of social distancing. You see, we got the camera further back. It's harder to see us because we're supposed to stay a certain distance apart. So we're doing that. Hopefully you're doing that even while you watch. Okay, point number one, continuing from our thoughts last week, comes from verse 5 of 1 Corinthians 13, and that is, how do you say I love you? You say it with calmness. And the text says love is not provoked. And obviously we know what the word provoked means. It means to cause a certain reaction from you. And it's interesting because, one of the great blessings of being in a good marriage or a good relationship is that you get to know each other better than everybody else. You learn what somebody likes and what they dislike. And actually that causes you to appreciate somebody more. The more of that kind of thing that you learn about each other, because you learn more about who they are, and so you react better to each other. But there's a negative side to that as well, because it could be the case that what happens is we use that information, we use that knowledge in a hurtful way. Everybody knows, if you'll admit it, that you know how to push the buttons on your spouse if you want a reaction, or you want to ping them a little bit, you wanted to hurt them just a little bit. I hate to use that word, hurt them, but you know what you can say to irritate them and cause a particular response, and that's to provoke them, right? And that's what we're dealing with here in this idea of calmness.
Yeah, one of the things that I always tell people about Brenna, and I mean no offense to her in this, but living with Brenna is like living with a middle schooler. Not that she is immature, but like middle schoolers know the exact right thing to make you feel self-conscious or to make you frustrated or make you mad about yourself. And when you live with someone, they too know that.
You're going to be in trouble this first time you do this.
Yeah, I know. Well, I had a sermon story that I wanted to tell that I can't do now that Brenna's here.
Okay.
So
you could do that if she was still in Tennessee.
Yeah.
Okay. But we know how it works. We try to elicit a response. And by the way, what we're dealing with here is not, the Bible never teaches you how your wife is supposed to be or how your husband is supposed to be. The Bible never tells you that you're supposed to make sure that your wife acts a certain way or your husband acts a certain way. What the Bible tells you is how you're supposed to be. And so our response to whatever, I guess if Rich is already in trouble, I may as well get in trouble as well. My wife knows what buttons to push, and when she does that, my response is what we're talking about here. How do I respond when the situation is such that I have been, if you will, provoked? And there's only two options. You can either go down the path of escalating whatever potential conflict is coming, or close, or you can walk away with it. I kind of think of the account with Cain and Abel. When that conflict occurred between Cain and God about his sacrifice not being accepted, and then Abel even spoke to him. When God comes to Cain, he tells him, sin is crouching at the door. You're in a difficult place where you got to make a decision whether you're going to open the door and let sin into your life, or you're going to turn around and do the right thing. And of course, we all know he chose to allow sin to continue. His anger got worse, and he murdered his brother. And in our families, obviously, I hope we're not talking something as far as with Cain, but we're at the door where we can choose to let in and make the situation worse, or we can de-escalate it.
Yeah, one of the things I think about a lot with this idea is the way that we treat God and the way that he responds. From the beginning of human history, from when God created us, we have pushed his buttons by doing the exact things that he wants us not to do, the exact things he tells us not to do. And time again, from the story of creation onward, God replies with mercy and with calmness in ways that we probably can't do. We're not capable.
Or don't, at least.
Or don't, yeah.
Even if we could, we don't.
We don't. And yet God chooses the righteous route.
Yeah, and his example is clearly what we're supposed to be following. That brings up a question: is why do we do that? Why do we push buttons? Why do we try to elicit a negative response even from those that we love? And I've thought about that, and there's only a couple of options, I guess. I think sometimes when husbands do it, we do it because we think it's fun or it's funny. But I'm not sure it ever works out that way. Maybe we start thinking that's the way it's going to be, but when we're in trouble, it's not as much fun anymore, is it? Right? I mean,
it always seems like a good idea.
It's not fun. Some people say because they want to get even, which is obviously not, or some people do it because they want to get even. That's obviously not the response, that we should be, the direction we should be going. Like Rich was talking a moment ago. If I think about all the things that people did to Jesus, clearly things that he never deserved, things that he never brought upon himself, and I'm thinking if I'm in that situation, my immediate reaction is to respond and to hurt or get even or whatever, and that's what I have to fight against. And his example was he never did any of that. He always responded in the appropriate way, and that's what we should be doing with our spouses. It's possible even sometimes we don't know that we're doing it. Sometimes we're just oblivious to the needs of our spouse, to the feelings of our spouse, and maybe that's the time to back up and say, this is what happens, this is what I feel when you act this way. Maybe it gets back to communication. If I act a certain way toward my spouse, I need to know how that makes her feel and how she responds to that, because maybe I'm hurting her and I don't even know. And love does not provoke.
I mean, so often I think that concept that we don't know what we're doing is especially true in the role of a husband and wife, on the side of the husband more often than the wife. And yet I think we need to take time to look at the response that we get and decipher what that means. Because not all of us are dumb. We may play it, but we're capable of learning what our spouses are sensitive to.
If we learn a lot of things about them, we're capable of learning that as well. So there's options. What do we do instead of escalating a situation, instead of provoking it? We have compassion. We seek what is best for our family instead of what hurts our family. We seek what is best for those that we love instead of doing those things that hurt them or hinder our relationship. And we communicate. We show affection. We're honest. All those are options that are obviously better than escalating a situation or provoking our spouse to anything else. You want to add anything before we go to number 2?
Yeah. One thing that always strikes me is the ability you have to de-escalate a situation. If you're the one being provoked, responding with calmness in the way that Jesus did, the idea of turning the other cheek, is so effective in a way that you wouldn't expect it to be. I think about Jesus and the king that the Jewish people wanted him to be, one who would go out and fight and take revenge on the Roman Empire, and yet his message of peace and pacifism and love was so much more effective at accomplishing his goals. And I think as a husband and wife, as spouses, as people who know each other, that too can be effective.
Okay, point number 2. And by the way, sometimes I monopolize this, so I have to stop and pull Rich in every once in a while so I don't do all the talking, because that can happen. But point number 2, how do you say I love you? You say it with optimism. And that's verse 7 of 1 Corinthians 13 when Paul says love hopes all things. And you know, hope is actually a part of the DNA, if you will, of the Christian. Hope is what allows us to get through challenges like this current kind of shelter in place or whatever isolation that we're going through. We can go through this because we hope that on the other side things kind of return back to a normal place or a better place, and we can worship and have our Bible studies through the internet temporarily because we know that, or we hope that there's a time when everything will be okay and we'll be able to get back together. So that's a good thing. But this idea of hope doesn't always get extended to others. And this is one of my wife kind of makes fun of me saying this, but this is one of my hobby horses, if you will. As it relates to Christians, you know, why is it that when you hear a gossip or a rumor about a Christian, you immediately go to the bad place with them? You know, you immediately think bad, you immediately think evil, instead of thinking, you know, maybe this is a lie. Maybe it's a misunderstanding. Maybe there's information that I don't have. Well, this idea of love having hope means what you're extending to somebody is what is good and what is right before you extend to them criticism and judgment and condemnation and everything else. And if that's true about our brethren, it ought to certainly be true about our spouses, right?
I mean, I wouldn't even just say that hope or faith is this concept that's essential to Christianity. I think it's essential to who God is. From when God created man in the garden, he gave them free will, knowing that they could do wrong with it, and yet he had hope, he had faith that they would do right. And even when they chose not to, he still extended that mercy and that grace, giving them an opportunity to come back to him. And I think that's essential to what we should do in our relationships, that we should have the best intentions, we should have the best thoughts, hope for our spouse. And when they do wrong, we don't pull it away. We just continue to give them more and more chances.
We tend to get suspicious. A couple of easy illustrations. You know, let's say, for example, to the wives, if your husband just out of character, and I hope this is not always out of character for us, but, you know, if out of character your husband got up one night after supper and started doing the dishes, you know, would your immediate reaction be, okay, what did he do wrong that he's all of a sudden doing dishes? Or would you just, you know, put forth pure motives to him, project pure motives to him, or bad? I remember one day, it was not long after Terry, many years ago, went to work at the dermatology office, and, you know, to celebrate her new job, I had gone and bought flowers. And so I just took them to her work and dropped them off. And I could hear people saying, well, I wonder what he did, or I wonder what he got in trouble for, or whatever. We project that this is not, but you know, hope says, maybe your husband or your wife has good intentions. Maybe they have good motives. Maybe they're trying to be a better spouse or a better person or express their love in a better way. That's this idea of love hopes all things, you know?
Yeah. To continue on with our points, I know you have mentioned here the idea that changing your spouse, that you can...
Yeah.
This idea that you don't believe that marrying somebody with the intention of changing them is an effective tactic.
Yeah, that's a bad idea.
And I agree. But I'm glad you have a subpoint under it saying that God can then choose to change.
And in fact, I think that God has. I know he's changed me, obviously, over the years. I think my wife would agree with that. I'm different than I was 33 years ago, which is about how long we've been married. See, I can remember how long I've been married. It's easier for you, isn't it? Yeah. 33 years.
I still have to count on my one hand.
Yeah. But that's a good point, and that is, you know, there are too many today who, when they're dating or whatever in their relationship, they overlook what would ordinarily be a dangerous characteristic or a characteristic that doesn't fit. And one or the other will think, well, when we get married, I'll change them. And that doesn't happen. There's only two things that can change a person. God can change a person, and that person can change themselves. And quite frankly, most of the time, the way that God changes a person is through that person changing themselves, not from you changing them.
But I would like to point out that one of the big passages we have about the submissive wife is this idea we have a wife married to a non-believing husband, and they're giving instructions on how she should live a godly life in hopes that it would influence him. And I think that's an important part of our relationship. When we're not getting the response or the actions out of a spouse that we want, the way we act can often have an influence on how they act towards us.
That's how God can change them, through our influence like that. Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. Okay, so God and God never tells me to make my wife a better wife. God never tells her to make me a better husband. God tells me to be a better man and a better husband, a better friend, a better neighbor, and when that happens, that He can change people through me.
I see later on you talk about the other big passage of submissive wives, or lack of better translation. You counter it with Ephesians 5:25.
Yeah.
The idea that even though the wife is below the husband, the husband is supposed to love his wife so much to the point of self-sacrifice in imitation of what Jesus did. And I think that's a part of this relationship that we so often neglect. We focus on the wife's duties in a Christian home, and we don't keep reading to where we're told that the husband has this greater sense of duty to love past the point of himself.
You know, adding to that, there needs to be a level of appreciation. You know, sometimes people, especially if somebody's married to somebody who's not a Christian, and they want so much because they love them for that person to become a Christian, they don't have appreciation for where they are now or even how they have changed or improved over time, and so that person never sees any motivation to keep going, to keep growing. I remember many years ago when I was in high school, one of my first jobs was working at a grocery store, and part of the responsibility of that job, you know, we did the sacking and the carrying out of groceries and the restocking of shelves. But another thing that happened was what we called facing the shelf, which is where you took, like for example, in the soup aisle, and the cans of soup, as people would take them out, they would get further and further back in, and the shelf would look kind of cluttered, and you know, maybe you couldn't even see what was on the shelf. And when you faced the shelf, you pulled the cans all to the front, so everything looked smooth and nice, and it was easily accessible. You could see everything easy, and so we would do that. And I remember one day, it was a particularly slow day, and I was working at facing a whole aisle, and I had gone through the whole aisle, and I was down to the last 3 or 4 feet of this aisle of getting everything faced out and looking nice and good. And my boss walked by, and he looked at it, and he said, you know, how long have you been working on this? And I told him, I don't remember how long it was. I didn't think it was that long, but I told him, and his response was, well, the aisle would look okay if you just get done with the last 3 feet. And I thought to myself, I've done 30 feet of aisle, and all he can see is the last 3 feet. And I think we do that sometimes with our spouses. They work and they grow and they become more and become better, and we don't acknowledge that, and it just doesn't help our relationship be what God wants it to be. We need to have hope and optimism with our spouse. You want to add anything before we go to point 3?
No, I'm excited for point 3.
Okay, point number 3. How do you say I love you? You say it with endurance. Again, 1 Corinthians 13, verse 7, love bears all things. That one sounds a little weird to me because it sounds like we just kind of tolerate each other, you know. Bears all things. We tolerate each other. I'm not talking about tolerating. I'm talking about finishing a race, you know. That's what Paul talked about when he talked about his own life. When he wrote to Timothy, he said, I have finished my race. And then he talked about the crown of life and everything. Well, that's a marriage. You know, we make a commitment to each other that we don't think, you know, a man and woman stand in front of a crowd of witnesses and they say the vows. And I know that we do vows a little differently nowadays, but generally speaking, they'll say something about, you know, good times and bad times, or health and sickness, or poverty or riches or whatever. But we don't mean that. Most people don't mean that. When they have in their mind in sickness and in health, they're not thinking about sickness. They're thinking about health. When the good times and bad, they're not thinking about the bad times. But yet, that is what we deal with, isn't it? That's where our commitment has to come from. That's where the endurance, a marathon in South Florida is not the same thing as a marathon in the mountains of Washington, right? It's different. It takes endurance to go through the difficulties.
Yeah, one thing that this makes me think of is in Luke's account of Jesus giving the model prayer, following it, he talks about this idea of knocking on the door. And that if you knock once, the person's not going to answer in the middle of the night. But if you keep pounding on that door, somebody's going to come and answer it. And he compares that to our prayer life. Now, I don't think that's nagging. I don't think God is asking us to nag in prayer or with our spouse. But I think he's telling us we need to be committed to the idea of prayer, and we need to be committed to the idea of making a relationship work.
It's got to endure. And that commitment, I don't believe, and I've said this many times, I don't believe that a Christian ought to have in their vocabulary at home the word divorce. I don't think a Christian should ever, in the heat of an argument or any other time, say to their spouse, I'm thinking about leaving you, or I'm thinking about divorcing you, because that's quitting the race. And you made a commitment that said, no matter what, we're going to try to get through this together. And you know what? It may be a long, hard journey. It may be a very difficult road, but you got to tell each other, look, whatever it's going to take to fix this, and however long it's going to take to fix this, I'm here. I'm committed. I'm gonna deal with this together. We're going to deal with this, and we're going to get through this. And when we get to the other side of it, we're going to be better. Nobody who has celebrated a large or a high number of anniversaries, like these people that make it to 50 years together, they didn't get there because they had 50 years of honeymoon. They didn't have 50 years of skipping from mountaintop to mountaintop to mountaintop. They had valleys, and they got through those valleys together, which is how they got to the 50 years.
Yeah. One of the points you make in your note is the idea of Job. How Job had to endure such heartbreak, such loss, both financial and physical and spiritual. He lost pretty much everything that ever meant anything to him. And when everything was coming down towards an end and he was at the lowest point in his life, his wife asked him, "Are you still committed? If not, curse God and die." She was ready to throw in the towel.
And it's easy. When you look at that situation, you have to recognize they both lost everything. Job and his wife both lost their children. They both lost their income. They both lost all those people that were close to them, yet they responded in different ways. And I'm not trying to say, I don't want to criticize her. I think she made the wrong choice, but I don't want to be overly critical of her, because how many of us go through difficulties and we end up in the same place? What I want to be is better. What I want to be is Job, who, though I don't understand, though I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, though I don't know where this is going to end up, I want to know and have the faith to know that God does know. And since he does know that, I can get through this, and my family can get through this, whatever it is, and the only way we're going to get through it is with God and with each other.
Yeah.
Anything?
I think that's exactly the point of one of the main points of Job, is that this concept of endurance, especially, I like you pointed out, when you don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. So often in our own lives, in marriages and relationships, things don't look like they're getting better anytime soon. And that's one thing that I think a lot of people struggle with, because nobody ever tells you that at a certain point in your life there are going to be more bad days than there are good. And Job was in that point of his life, and yet he chose to hold on.
All right, I don't know how long we've gone. I don't have a timer here. We've talked for a while, whatever it is. Let me just encourage us. I did this last week. I'm going to do it again. I want to encourage us to read through the early part of 1 Corinthians 13 and don't look at your spouse. Don't look at your spouse and say, well, I sure wish they were better. No, look at yourself. Examine yourself. Contrast yourself with what God says in his word, and figure out, how can I be better? How can I be better today? How can I be a better husband, a better wife, a better friend, a better neighbor, a better brother, whatever it is that your situation, your relationship is? How can I be better? How can I show love the way that God wants me to? And I think that chapter helps us a great deal in that. And obviously, I hope that it's not very long that we're back together having our classes, and I guess If we're not back together by then, which I don't anticipate we will be, then next week we're going to have to come up with something else to go on in these classes on Wednesday nights for a while. But I think it's been good for us to be together. I hope that this is helping us. I know we're at home with family, and that adds some stress that maybe we haven't felt because we've been so busy with everybody else. But that's a good time to build. I remember particularly when I was a kid, we took a vacation to the Smoky Mountains, and we had a station wagon, and we had a pop-up camper, and 2 weeks through the Smoky Mountains in that car, and those were not great memories with sisters that would pick on me and all of that, but it was afterwards. When you're going through it, it was rough, but afterwards you grow closer and you appreciate each other. And maybe that's what's happening with our isolation right now.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
But we want to thank you for our time. We appreciate the opportunity to use this media to teach the scriptures and to help us grow closer to God. And we hope that everybody is continuing to be spiritual, continuing to look to God to get through these difficult times, continuing to be safe and smart with your own health and with your family. And hopefully we'll see everybody soon. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.